Steve Jobs, Walter Isaacson's enthralling, worldwide best-selling biography of Apple co-founder Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs and Bill Gates go back to the late 1970s when Bill Gates was writing BASIC for the Apple II computer. And back then, Apple was a much bigger company. So when Steve Jobs created the Macintosh, he brings Bill Gates down and shows him the beautiful graphical interface and gets Bill Gates all excited about writing software, including Word and Excel and spreadsheets, things like that, for the Macintosh. What he didn't realize is that Bill Gates would end up creating his own graphical user interface, Windows, and taking a lot of the business away from Apple. And so what you have is a great love-hate rivalry friendship that goes for more than 30 years. And at the end of the book, I have Bill Gates visiting Steve Jobs when he's sick in Palo Alto, talking about Steve Jobs' model and Bill Gates admitting it really worked well, having that integrated end-to-end product. And Steve Jobs even saying, your model worked well too. So even though they were rivals, they knew that they were the two binary stars of the digital age. When Steve Jobs came back to Apple in 1997, he realized he needed to restore the relationship with Bill Gates, because Bill Gates and Microsoft were no longer writing that much software for Apple computers. So he just called up Bill Gates, said, I'm coming to see you, and I want you to start writing great software for the Mac again. And Bill Gates had a soft spot for Apple and said, sure, and even took an investment in Apple. And it was the one great mistake that Steve Jobs made in terms of announcement. He announced it at a Macworld in Boston, and then he put Bill Gates up on the screen to talk about it, looming on the screen. And it almost looked like that 1984 ad with Big Brother on the big screen looming behind it. And all the fans of Apple at Macworld started booing, and Steve had to say, no, 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 sometimes your rivals are also your friends. Apple products reflect Steve Jobs because they're beautiful. They have a great aesthetic. They're done in great taste. And as Steve Jobs once said about Bill Gates, he says, you know, he's a good businessman, but he just has no taste. He doesn't have a passion for music or art or design. And so indeed, Windows products, Microsoft products, are very good. And they get better every time there's a new edition of them. But it's not like Steve Jobs, who makes sure that the minute he launches a product, it is beautifully designed and just stuns you as it comes out of the box. If you look at an iPod in the box, it looks like a little gem as you pull it out. If you get a Zune from Microsoft, it's a very competent product, but it does look like it's been designed in Uzbekistan or someplace. And that's why Steve Jobs always said the one thing we're bringing is a passion for great design, great art, and great taste. And that's why Apple is always standing at that intersection of art and technology. The key to Steve Jobs' genius, I think, is the marriage of creativity with science. He loves to say that when he was a kid, he loved the liberal arts, but then he became an electronics geek. If you look at people in the world today, some are great at technology, like Bill Gates. Some are great at the arts, whether it's, Bono or the Beatles. But Steve Jobs could appreciate both camps, and that is what makes a great 21st century company, but frankly, a 21st century economy, is being creative, but also connecting it to the science. Steve Jobs can be really brutal to the people he works with. He can really push them, and some people break under the pressure, but if you're really able to stand up to him, he loves it. They give an award to the person who stands up best to Steve Jobs. That started back in the old Macintosh days in the early 80s. So he can be very, very demanding, but he loves it when people stand up to him. I think Steve Jobs admires people who have great creativity and have a spiritual aura to them. You know, Gandhi, the Maharaji, who was his spiritual leader when he took up Zen Buddhism, but also Einstein, and then people who were great technologists and artists such as Edison and Ford. If you look at the Think Different ads, he picked out every one of those. That Picasso picture, that John Lennon picture, Bobby Kennedy. He wanted to show who his heroes were, and that's what distinguished those Think Different ads. In the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of strands came together in California. You had the hippie movements, you had the free speech movement, but you also had self-awareness and spirituality and Est and Esalen and Zen Buddhism. You also had the computer culture, the wireheads, the electronic geeks, the phone freakers and stuff like that. They tended not to get along too well until the early 80s, when people like Steve Jobs came from both camps, loved reading the Whole Earth catalog, but also loved reading popular electronics and figuring that out. I think that's where Apple comes from, is that mix of the counterculture and technology. In 2003, I got a phone call from Steve Jobs. Out of the blue, I'd just become head of the Aspen Institute. He knew me from my days at Time magazine, and he said he wanted to have a talk with me. I said, fine. We took a walk, and he said, why don't you do a biography of me? I had just done Ben Franklin, was working on Albert Einstein, and at first I thought, wow, he thinks he's, Franklin, Einstein, he's next in the sequence. And I said, you could be around another 20, 30 years. Why don't we wait until you retire? And then over the years, he talked to me a couple more times. And finally, I realized that, he was sick and worried about how long he had. And I said, sure, I'd do this book because Steve Jobs represents the intersection of creativity and technology. And that's what I'd been writing about in Franklin and Einstein and everybody else. Steve Jobs always is able to be very persuasive, and the people at Apple used to call it his reality distortion field. He'd say, we have to finish this project by the end of next month. And they'd all say, no way. And he'd say, yes, it can be done. And lo and behold, they would do it. He was pretty good in working with me on this book because he said, I'm not going to have any control. It's going to be your book. From the very first day we spoke till just recently, when we were finishing up our interviews, he said, just remember, it's your book. I'm not even going to read it before it comes out. When I started writing this book, I told him, I'm going to have to speak to not only your friends and colleagues, but also enemies and people you've fired and former girlfriends. And at first, I don't think he was all that comfortable with it, but as I started doing my interviews, I soon had interviewed more than 100 people he had dealt with. Now it's probably close to 200, and it's interesting. You get a well-rounded picture, and he's a complicated guy. It's a little bit like that Rashomon effect. So many people tell you so many different things, and you try to shape the picture from that.
Based on more than 40 interviews with Steve Jobs conducted over 2 years, as well as interviews with more than 100 family members, friends, adversaries, competitors, and colleagues. Walter Isaacson has written a riveting story of the roller coaster life and searingly intense personality of a creative entrepreneur whose passion for perfection and ferocious drive revolutionized 6 industries: personal computers, animated movies, music, phones, tablet computing, and digital publishing. Isaacson's portrait touched millions of readers. At a time when America is seeking ways to sustain its innovative edge, Jobs stands as the ultimate icon of inventiveness and applied imagination. He knew that the best way to create value in the 21st century was to connect creativity with technology. He built a company where leaps of the imagination were combined with remarkable feats of engineering. Although Jobs cooperated with the author, he asked for no control over what was written. His tale is instructive and cautionary, filled with lessons about character, leadership, and values. Click on the link below to grab your Audible Kindle paperback or hardcover copy. This is a channel dedicated to detailed review of the best online books. Bookfy loves books.